What we'd like to do now in terms of the lunch period, we've got a really special keynote speech coming up by Anne-Marie Carroll, the head of York Region Transit, which I'm super excited about. One of the most innovative transit systems in this country, in my view, and one of the most innovative leaders around transit in this country. And as a preface to Anne-Marie, we wanted to take folks through the Pan-Canadian Electric Bus project that we've been working on for the last several years that finally has launched in operation in Vancouver as of last week and was recently announced as fully funded in York Region Transit and York Region in the town of Newmarket, as well as Brampton Transit and the city of Brampton. We're really proud of this, not because of what QTRIC's done, but because of what our transit agency partners have done in partnership with the manufacturers. This project literally has set a world standard, helped to set a world standard, and it is starting to be the motivational factor behind the publication of the J3105 standard that will allow for full interoperability of electric buses and chargers across Canada. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pan-Canadian Electric Bus demo and integration trial, we actually started it way back in 2016. It was the idea that we wanted to do something in Canada that wasn't being done elsewhere in the world. And what wasn't happening elsewhere in the world was standardization or interoperability. There were a lot of pilots, and at that time in Canada too, you probably remember, everybody was doing a little pilot here, a 6-week pilot there, a 6-month pilot here with one electric bus, one charging system, usually temporary, and almost none of it was leading to a system procurement. So that was a problem, and a lot of tax dollars were going into those pilots and not resulting in any kind of long-term electrification strategy. And the second problem is we kept hearing from people saying, well, you know, we piloted the bus, but we don't know which ones are going to work with the other ones and what charging system to go with, and nobody's telling us, nobody's giving us a Bible that we can read that tells us the pathway to salvation in electrification. That just didn't exist. And then there was one project that was happening in Canada that really set the standard for integration and systems thinking, and that was in STM as part of Cité Mobilité with Nova Bus, and that was the first overhead high-power charging system in downtown Montreal, a full systems effort where the engineers at STM did a fantastic job of getting these large pieces of equipment integrated into downtown Montreal. So we had that great project, but information about that project wasn't being disseminated across the country. So we had all of these problems together, combined with all of the issues that were raised earlier by the panelists about people thinking from a diesel perspective and that creating additional challenges to procurement. So we sat back and we said, okay, well, what can we do in this country nobody else has done? We have a small economy, small GDP, but we do have manufacturers and we do have some innovative transit agencies. And so we decided to see if Nova Bus and New Flyer and ABB and Siemens would agree to redesign their systems, both vehicle and charger, to be interoperable and fully standardized. And at that time, and still today, it's technically accurate to say there was no and still is no official standard for interoperability. J3105-1 and -2 are now being published, so that is changing as of this year. But at that time, there was nothing. There was only, when we looked around, the OpCharge protocol, which was an open source protocol in Europe that Volvo Group had published, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe with Siemens support, is the starting basis for an overhead charging system that people could align their systems with. So we latched onto that. Not all of OpCharge works in Canada, and there's some things in Canada that needed to be added to OpCharge, but we latched onto that, and thankfully New Flyer, Nova Bus, ABB, and Siemens said yes, that they would agree to go forward in about 3 years of what is probably and definitively the most difficult project I've ever been part of in my entire career. And if you had asked me what is the most challenging part about it, 4 years ago, I would have said probably the engineering, because the systems integration and the bus platforms and the amount of work in the engineering. I think the engineering actually ended up being the easiest part. Despite the last hurdles of actual civil deployment and operational deployment, the engineering is pretty much just the basic mechanical mathematics that comes and engineers make things happen. The hardest part was definitely the politics. Bar none, the politics were mostly the cause of any kind of headache that we did have came from a political section. And by politics, I don't just mean federal or provincial or municipal politics. Those existed, and those were challenges, and we had to convince a lot of councillors and a lot of politicians. And, you know, there's never underestimate the value of stoking egos. I think it's very, very important in trying to get these kinds of projects forward. But also the politics of just transit, the way that transit has historically worked, the way that procurement has historically worked. And so getting over those hurdles hurdles, we've now launched a project that is interoperable. It has 4 OEMs as partners, 3 transit agencies, 5 routes, 2 utilities. This is a little out of date. We have Newmarket Tay Power Distribution and BC Hydro as partners in the project. A total of 18 electric buses. The goal originally was 16. We got to 18, and 7 overhead chargers. So that means that in Vancouver, in Brampton, in York Region, there will be Nova buses and New Flyers on the same route, plugging and playing into ABB and Siemens en route chargers on the same route for full day operation. A true demonstration worldwide of interoperability, and there's no such project like this in the world. And so it just proves that we might be small as Canadians and a Canadian economy, or rather Canada might be small, but we're certainly mighty in our impact if we choose to use those fantastic institutions we have of education, social welfare, fantastic infrastructure. We can do things that absolutely lead the world, even though we only have 36 million so people in this country. And so here's just a little announcement from Brampton, and we're looking forward to that procurement now happening and the buses getting out on the road. This was our announcement recently in the summer at York Region in Newmarket, and most recently here was the announcement in Vancouver just last week. Doesn't come across in the photos totally clearly, but those buses do glow in the dark, so I still say they're the sexiest buses in the country. You need to get there, you need to get a photo on those buses. And that has led us to realize that we want to move forward even further. We started a little while ago trying to create a phase 2 project. The phase 2 project would definitely focus on J3105 and J1772 for in-depot compliance. I think the industry general view now is J3068 is no longer applicable in this context. So you'd have depot and en route standardization. We definitely realized already from our own modeling using our Route I modeling tool that demand charges are an issue. And in some of these jurisdictions, even when you optimize the use of that charging system, you may still need to have energy storage integration. And yet there is no standard for energy storage integration with high-powered charging systems or low power. And so we wanted to integrate the new standards that are emerging with the buses, with the chargers, with the energy storage, and of course, hype up the power to get it to 600 kilowatts. More power, fewer minutes of charging on the route, trying to get eventually one day to maybe 1 megawatt chargers so that the charging episode is down to 15 to 30 seconds rather than a few minutes. That's where we're going with it. Stay tuned for that. The big challenge coming up with this project is once you get to this size and scope, you're really hitting triggers in municipalities that focus on public tendering. And phase 1 was outside the public tender process. Phase 2 probably will be within the public tender process environment. And so we are launching an initiative around what we call the Innovation P3. There's no way to do this expensive, complicated stuff from within a transit agency on its own. And so an innovative P3 model that has the operations, the maintenance, the financing, and the capital assets is what we're now pursuing. And lastly, this project has led to our next big idea at CUTRIC. And this one I'm giddy over because the world needs it and nobody's doing it because it's hard to do. The private sector needs it, but the private sector can't do it because nobody will trust them to do it. And this is a big data trust for mobility-related innovation. And the sub-name that we use behind closed doors is the Electric Bus Big Data Trust. We may call it the ACES Big Data Trust, the Automated, Connected, Electric, and Shared Mobility Data Trust. But what this is in those 18 electric buses and 7 overhead chargers in phase 1, there are loggers on all of those systems. And so we learned from Winnipeg, we learned from Montreal, we learned from the systems that said to us, look, we didn't collect nearly enough data. And what we did collect, we didn't collect in a standardized form, or we didn't share it, we didn't analyze it, it wasn't real time, it wasn't cloud-based. And so a lot of opportunity in Canada has been lost through a lack of data collection. And so we got loggers on board all the buses and all the chargers that are going out the door as part of phase 1. All of those data will feed into a cloud in real time. CUTRIC is setting up this big data trust to be able to manage it in a cyber secure and legally sound way. And the idea is that every city in Canada that wants to eventually be able to log in or get into this consortium of big data can see in real time how Vancouver's electric buses are working and how Brampton's Siemens chargers are working or how York Region's ABB charger may be working in the future, rather than waiting for the once-a-year annual conference where we show up and we talk a little bit about how those performance measures are happening. And so the idea is create a data trust, flow all the data in, give cities and transit agencies free access, and if the private sector wants to access it because they can innovate all sorts of really great devices and tools and software controls for you, they need to pay their way in, and there's a certain amount of aggregation that occurs so they can't see the specific info about each individual unit or manufacturer. If we can create that, that will be the world's first public data trust for mobility. And frankly, I think it will just escalate Canada's position in the world around electrification. When we presented this idea to our colleagues at APTA, they were quite frank in saying that would be nearly impossible in the US to establish. At least right now, it would be very, very difficult to get cities from New York to LA to agree to feed into a common cloud data platform to share data of electric buses across the jurisdictions. And we can do it in Canada because, albeit as a constitutional monarchy, which I don't agree with, but the handy thing about being a constitutional monarchy is your provinces actually function pretty similarly to one another, and it is possible to engage in data sharing across this jurisdiction. So with that, stay tuned because we have a lot more coming up on that big data trust, and I hope that is just going to blow open the marketplace for those transit agencies struggling to go to electrification because they don't have enough data at their fingertips. And this would provide it instantaneously in a way that Canadians like to do, which is sharing as taxpayers and sharing experiences across communities.